Hi guys, I'm here today to do my wrap-up video of the books that I read in January. Just one video for the whole month, but it's still not going to be an overlong video, I think. I read quite a few books in January, but some of them were non-fiction, and I'm going to do a separate non-fiction wrap-up video of all the recent non-fiction in a bit. So I have 6 books left that I'd like to talk to you about. Of 5 of them, I only have ebook copies to show you. There are different reasons why I might choose to buy an ebook copy of a book, or why I might have to buy an ebook copy of a book. But in this case, all 5 books were throwaway books, by which I mean books that I know in advance, or I'm quite positive that I won't want to read them again, and I don't want books of that kind to clutter my shelves, and I never know who to give them to, and it's always such a hassle to find a used bookshop here in this town, in this country, to sell them to, so I'm quite happy to just buy the cheap ebook copy. If I lived in an English-speaking country, I'd just check those books out from the library, but it's not just the language thing, but in Germany, while our academic library network is top, and I love my university's library, and I've never had, in 15 years, I haven't had one reason to complain. While that's good, our municipal libraries are total shit, and it's not their fault, it's the government's fault, the government policy's fault, at least in this state, at least I think so. I'd like to think that it's not the library's own fault. But anyway, that's a topic for a different video, if at all. So on to the books. I have to say my reading year so far has unfortunately been rather meh. And while most of the books that I read in January weren't exactly bad books, they didn't exactly wow me either. And that's partly my own fault, because in most of these cases I knew going in that they wouldn't become my new favorite books of all time. But at least for one of them, the one with which I started my reading year, for that one I did have some high expectations. It is a booktube darling. It's Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. This book is about a family, a man and his 2 young sons, whose wife and mother has recently died, and we now follow them through the different stages of their grief, I guess you could say, from the beginning in which the event and their grief and their shock and denial and rage are this all-consuming thing that is all that they can think about, and how they then slowly come to terms with it, and with how the husband in particular, the widower, slowly comes to terms with the idea that his life is going to go on, and that he's going to have to find a new way of living. Now, because the widower happens to be a tattoo scholar, his grief, or rather the whole bundle of his emotions, manifests in the book as in the form of Crow. And Crow is this figure that Tattoos created in his poetry collection of the same name, Crow. And Crow is kind of the element of chaos and destruction, and kind of the embodied counterpart to the orderly principle of the world's creator. Crow in this book is not the exact Crow from the poetry collection. He is both more complicated and less decidedly negative and destructive. So, like I said, he is the embodiment of all the father's complicated and conflicting emotions. And this figure, Crow, guides the man and his sons through their process, and the moment the storm of emotions quiets down inside the man, Crow disappears. This book has moved a lot of people to tears, and I fully expected it to do the same to me, and it completely failed to do so. For me, it was obvious the whole time that this is an intellectual game. To me, it didn't have any emotional depth whatsoever. The testimonies on this book say that it is heartrending and funny and warm and real and sad, and I didn't see any of it. I thought it was sterile and, like I said, an intellectual game. And it also ultimately has very little to say, I think. This makes me a bit worried because I also bought the hardcover edition of Lanny by Max Porter when I was still under the assumption that this would be a sweeping, sensational read for me. But who knows, perhaps in Lanny, Max Porter was able to draw a bit more from an actual emotional connection that he has to the topic. At least that's what I'm hoping for. The next book that I want to talk about, and which was actually my second read of the year, did make me cry. It's one of 3 romance novels that I read in January. This one a contemporary romance, Glitterland by Alexis Hall. Alexis Hall is the author of the lovely novella Waiting for a Flood, which I reviewed in November, I think it was. I'll link it down below. In this book, our protagonist and narrator has bipolar disorder, and when the story starts, he's in a very bad state. He's almost suicidal. At a friend's stag do, he drinks, which he shouldn't because of his medication, and then he hooks up with a guy who is supposed to be a one-night stand, because this guy is everything that our narrator isn't. Our narrator is quite posh, he's highly educated, he has a degree from Cambridge, he's a writer, and of course he is chronically unhappy and brooding. Whereas his hookup is a happy-go-lucky, uneducated, fake-tanned, wannabe fashion model from Essex. If you are from Essex and you don't do self-irony, maybe stay away from this book. So this guy is almost from another planet, but as it turns out, he is just what our narrator needs. So this book is by turns funny and heartbreaking. It made me cry at 2 in the morning, but that may have been because it was 2 in the morning. In any case, it was unexpectedly touching, this book, and I can only say, please don't be deterred by either the cover or the somewhat stupid name. If you are looking for romance, this is a good one. And then I also read another 2 historical romances by Sebastian. These sure were no literary masterpieces, but quite enjoyable, especially the first one. There was the relationship between the 2 love interests was really great. That would be The Soldier Scoundrel with, I mean, look at this atrocious cover image. It's especially bad if you take into account that these 2 guys are supposed to be English. So this book is set in the early 19th century, and it is about 2 men who are obviously made for one another, but there's the slight issue that one of them's a peer and one is basically a criminal, and this class gap is kind of an obstacle to their relationship, beside the fact that the issue that they are both men. And this also has a mystery element because the lower class man is working as kind of a problem solver for wealthy clients, and most of these wealthy clients are women who are in some kind of many of them are suffering from domestic violence, some of them are being blackmailed, so he basically helps either out of this situation or helps them get the upper hand in whatever conflict they have found themselves in. So this was kind of cool, but with all of Sebastian's books there's always this issue of inauthenticity, and also there were also just issues in general with the writing. So it was nice to pass the time with it, and the 2 protagonists have amazing chemistry, but basically just not a good book. And the same goes for the second book in this series, which is the story of the brother of the scoundrel from the first book. This one's called the Lawrence Browne Affair, and it is a bit of a Beauty and the Beast retelling almost, in which this is also, I mean, the Scoundrel's brother is obviously also a lower class man with a criminal background, and his love interest is also, in this case, he's an earl, and the earl has severe social anxiety, and he's also almost traumatized from a difficult childhood. And he also thinks he has inherited some form of madness from his father, so he hides himself away in his castle and does science, which causes explosions from time to time. So he has earned the reputation of being quite a madman. And our man Georgie is now sent in to investigate and to learn if the Earl is truly mad. And yeah, the romance develops from there. This was quite cute, even though the protagonists didn't have the same chemistry as those of the first novel. But still, not a waste of time, not good literature either. And then I read two police procedurals in January. The first one was White Nights by Cleeves, which is the second book in the Shetland series, of which I read the first book, Raven Black, in December. So this one's also set on Shetland, obviously, on mainland Shetland, in a very small village, just like 5 houses on the coast, where a stranger is found hanged in a shed one morning. I did not enjoy this book as much as the first one. I enjoyed the midwinter atmosphere of the first book much more than the summer night atmosphere of the second book. And the second book also wasn't as suspenseful. A, because the victim left me completely indifferent, and B, because I thought that the identity of the murder was pretty obvious almost from the second that we saw the murderer in the book. What I did like was the depiction of Shetland society and of life in such a tiny, tiny community as the one we are talking about. I also really still like Inspector Perez because he is such an atypical protagonist and police inspector. I mean, atypical for a crime novel, a police procedural, because he is so completely unproblematic in his views. I also like how there's a romance between him and the character Fran, who was a very important person in the first book. And I like how that romance is progressing and how it is so very in character with Inspector Perez. And I've always liked Fran, and I hope that she will have a more important role to play in the coming books than she had in the second book. So, as you can see, I'm definitely going to continue with this series. And the other crime novel that I read in January is The Secret Place by Tana. This is the 5th book in the Dublin Murder Squad series. It's quite different from all the others, of which I've read only 2, but from what I gather, it's quite different. It takes place in a boarding school. So, a year before the events in our book take place, the body of a young boy was found on the grounds of a boarding school for girls, across the street from a boarding school for boys. The murder could never be solved and went to cold cases, but now an anonymous witness has come forward with a paper note. And the girl who found the note on the boarding school's blackboard is acquainted with Inspector Stephen Moran from Cold Cases and takes the note to him. And Stephen then teams up with Detective Antoinette Conway, who was on the case a year ago. And the two of them then spend one long day interrogating the girls in the boarding school, especially 2 gangs of girls, 2 gangs of 4 girls each. One gang is the mean girls and one gang the alternative ones. And in between the interviews, we get flashbacks of the year leading up to the murder of Chris Harper, the young murdered boy. It was fun, even though, again, I thought that the murderer was quite obvious from very early on, and I don't usually spot the murderer in books like this. But most of all, I had some realism issues. I thought that Tana French rather overdid it on the teen girl lingo, especially because the girls sounded more like American teenagers, American mean girls to me than Dublin mean girls. But I don't know, it's not like I have a lot of experience in that department. But most of all, I thought that the way that the two detectives conducted the interviews were rather, well, they seemed rather unrealistic to me in the way the detectives tiptoed around the girls' sensibilities all the time. I would expect that in real life, interviews like that would be conducted in a harsher way and wouldn't be... I can't imagine that in real life detectives would pretend to be playing along with the girls and their schemes and intrigues. I guess they would just say, come on girls, now let's all act like adults and not pretend that this isn't serious. But again, it's not like I have a lot of experience in this department, and it's just my impression, but such as it was, it did take away some of the enjoyment of the book for me, and it made me feel a bit impatient with the book. But I'm definitely still going to pick up another Dublin Murder Squad book in the future, or any other book that Tana French writes, because she's always interesting, even though I haven't always loved her books. So that's it for today. I hope this has been interesting. Please do let me know if you have thoughts on any of the books that I have talked about, especially if you've read the Tana French book and have any thoughts on the issues that I talked about. I'd be very interested in hearing that. I'll see you very soon with another video. Bye!